47 assistants had already quit. Some lasted weeks. One lasted only 3 hours. Everyone believed the 48th would be gone before lunch. Instead, she uncovered a secret that sent a billionaire's most trusted executive to prison and changed her boss forever. Dean Heather built his company from nothing. By the age of 26, he had turned a small logistics startup into one of the fastest-growing shipping and freight companies on the East Coast. People admired his mind. Nobody admired his temper. He was known for firing assistants within days, sometimes hours, over things that seemed almost too small to matter. A meeting that started 4 minutes late. An email that sat unanswered overnight. A misplaced folder. To everyone watching from the outside, it looked like the behavior of a man who simply couldn't be pleased. Nobody in that building knew what those small mistakes actually reminded him of. Nobody knew what he was really afraid of losing again. Lila Carter didn't know any of this when she accepted the job. She needed the work. Her lease was due in 2 weeks, and after months of interviews that led nowhere, this was the first company willing to give her a real shot. Her friends warned her. Her mother told her to turn it down. But Lila had grown up watching her own father work 3 jobs without complaint, and somewhere along the way she had learned that difficult didn't automatically mean dangerous. She told herself she could handle one demanding boss. She had no idea what she was actually walking into. The morning she arrived, the office went quiet the moment she stepped off the elevator. A few employees exchanged glances. Someone near the reception desk whispered just loud enough for her to catch it. "New one." Lila smiled politely, unaware that half the floor was already guessing how many days she'd survive. She sat down at a desk that still smelled faintly of the previous assistant's coffee, and tucked beneath a stack of folders, she found something odd. A letter of resignation, blank except for a date. Her own start date. It wasn't as strange as it first felt. HR kept a small stack of pre-dated resignation templates on hand at all times, an old habit built from years of assistance never lasting more than a few weeks. Still, seeing her own name paired with that date made her stomach tighten. She stared at it for a long moment before slipping it into a drawer, telling herself not to read too much into it. She didn't yet know how much of that office ran on quiet, practiced routine. That letter wasn't the strangest thing she'd find that week. It was only the smallest. What she noticed first wasn't Dean's temper. It was the way everyone around him moved like they were walking on glass, except for one man. Elvis Hayes, the company's longtime vice president of operations, was the only person who seemed completely at ease around Dean. He laughed at meetings. He interrupted without consequence. He was the one person Dean never raised his voice at, and Lila found that strange, because everyone else in that building seemed to be holding their breath around their boss every single hour of the day. Why was one man so comfortable, while 47 others had walked out the door in tears? It was the kind of question that sits quietly in your mind and refuses to leave. For the first 2 weeks, Lila didn't try to prove anything. She simply paid attention. She learned Dean's schedule before he even asked for it. She noticed which meetings he dreaded and rearranged them so he had breathing room in between. She caught a scheduling conflict before it became a problem, quietly fixing it without ever mentioning it to him. Dean didn't say thank you. He barely looked up from his desk. But for the first time in longer than anyone could remember, an entire week passed without him raising his voice once. The office noticed. Nobody said anything out loud, but people started watching her a little differently. Then came the first real test. A major client presentation vanished from the shared drive less than an hour before the meeting. Panic spread through the office in seconds. Assistants before Lila had been fired for far less. Dean stormed out of his office, already furious, already searching for someone to blame. Lila didn't flinch. She looked at him and said calmly, "Would you like me to fix this, or would you rather spend the next 10 minutes figuring out whose fault it is?" The room went silent. Nobody had ever spoken to him like that. For a moment, Dean just stared at her. Then, instead of exploding, he sat down and let her work. For the first time in years, Dean had let someone in. He had no idea what that would end up costing him. That night, after everyone else had gone home, Lila stayed behind rebuilding the missing files using the temporary offline copies she had made earlier that week while reorganizing the project folder. It wasn't part of her job. She just did it, The same quiet habit her father had taught her growing up. Always plan for the version of the day that goes wrong. By the time Dean walked past her desk on his way out, the presentation was already restored. He paused. He almost said something. Instead, he just nodded once and left. It wasn't gratitude, but it wasn't nothing either. Lila began noticing something else too. Dean never lost his temper over honest mistakes. If someone admitted they'd messed up right away, he'd sigh, correct it, and move on. It was the mistakes people try to hide, the delays nobody mentioned until it was too late, that set him off completely. She didn't understand why yet, but she started to sense that his anger wasn't really about perfection. It felt like something older, something he was still carrying. Have you ever met someone whose anger made more sense once you learned what they'd survived? Lila was about to learn exactly that. A few days later, small things started going wrong. A meeting that had been confirmed suddenly showed as canceled. A flight Dean needed for an out-of-state meeting was booked for the wrong date. An important email thread mysteriously disappeared from his inbox. Lila knew she hadn't made these mistakes. She'd triple-checked everything the night before. But there was no way to prove it, and whispers started moving through the office almost immediately. Elvis mentioned, in an almost gentle tone during a hallway conversation, that maybe this role simply wasn't the right fit for her. A few coworkers nodded along. Nobody defended her. She went home that night replaying every detail, trying to understand how so many things could go wrong at once, and why the person suggesting she wasn't cut out for the job seemed strangely unbothered by it all. She thought someone was trying to get her fired. She was wrong. Someone was trying to keep her quiet. Rather than panic, Lila did what she always did when something didn't add up. She started paying closer attention. Weeks earlier, she'd been given temporary administrative clearance to reorganize the company's old archive room, a task nobody else wanted. Late one evening, staying behind under the excuse of catching up on that filing, she quietly reviewed old personnel records, the kind nobody thinks to look at twice. Every single one of the 47 assistants before her had resigned following a string of unexplained errors, almost identical to what was happening to her now. And every one of those resignations had been processed and approved by the same person, Elvis Hayes. Not most of them, all 47. Lila sat there in the empty office, staring at the screen, feeling the weight of what she'd just found settle over her. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a pattern, and patterns don't happen by accident. If you're still with us, type, "I'm still here" in the comments. We'd love to know who's uncovering this mystery with us. Over the following weeks, Lila dug deeper, careful never to raise suspicion. It started small. She noticed a handful of invoice numbers that had been used twice, once for a legitimate order and once for something vaguer, filed months apart. That led her to the vendor names attached to the duplicates, companies she'd never heard mentioned in any meeting. Curious, she started tracking how often those same vendors were paid, and how similar the payment amounts always looked. Slowly, a picture began forming. Money had been quietly leaving Heather Global for years, funneled through shell companies that led back, again and again, to accounts connected to Elvis Hayes. It wasn't a small amount. It was millions, moved a little at a time, disguised as operational costs, consulting fees, logistics contracts that never existed. And every time an assistant got close enough to notice irregularities in the books, that assistant mysteriously started making mistakes, until they resigned or were let go. Dean's temper, his obsession with precision, had become the perfect distraction. Nobody stayed long enough to look past the surface. Nobody except Lila. She thought she'd found the answer. What she found next would explain why 47 assistants had disappeared, and it had nothing to do with money. While piecing this together, Lila stumbled onto something else entirely, something that had nothing to do with fraud and everything to do with why Dean was the way he was. Tucked inside a drawer in his office, beneath a stack of old files she'd been asked to reorganize, she found a photograph. Dean, maybe 17 years old, standing beside a younger girl with the same eyes and the same stubborn smile. On the back, in handwriting that looked rushed, almost hopeful, were 6 words. "See you at the celebration, promise." Lila asked one of the longest-serving employees, an older woman in accounting who'd been with the company since it started, if she knew who the girl in the photo was. The woman's expression changed instantly. She lowered her voice and asked, "You really don't know what happened to Olive?" 10 years earlier, Dean had been preparing for the single most important meeting of his young career, a chance to secure funding that would either save his struggling company or end it completely. His younger sister, Olive, had planned to meet him at a family celebration 2 states away that same weekend, something they'd promised each other months in advance. But an assistant's mistake, a wrong itinerary sent to international investors, threatened to collapse the entire meeting. Dean stayed behind to fix it. He told Olive to go ahead without him. "I'll be right behind you," he said. "I promise." She boarded that flight alone. On the drive from the airport to their family's gathering, the car she was traveling in was struck by a driver who ran a red light. Olive didn't survive. Dean arrived 11 hours later than planned, walking into a hospital hallway instead of a celebration, forced to say goodbye to his sister before he ever got the chance to keep his promise. From that day forward, every late email, every missed deadline, every small delay became something far heavier than an inconvenience. It became a reminder of the 11 hours that separated him from being there. He never blamed the assistant who made that mistake, not truly. He blamed himself for choosing to stay behind, for not being on that flight beside her. But guilt rarely listens to logic. His anger was never really about perfection. It was guilt wearing the mask of control, a man trying desperately to make sure nothing was ever late again, because the one time it mattered most, he was. If you've ever carried guilt over something you couldn't undo, you already understand Dean more than you realize. Understanding this changed something in Lila. She stopped seeing Dean as a difficult boss and started seeing him as a man still standing in that hospital hallway, 10 years later, every single day. But there wasn't time to sit with that discovery for long. Elvis had noticed how close Lila was getting, and he wasn't willing to let a decade of stolen money unravel because of one assistant who refused to quit. Lila thought she was close to the truth. She didn't know the truth was about to turn on her. Within days, everything turned against her. Security footage appeared, edited just enough to place her near restricted files late at night. Falsified bank transfers surfaced carrying what looked like her digital signature, later traced back to a set of stolen login credentials and a forged approval token generated from an old and used account of hers that IT had never fully closed out. Documents were altered to suggest she had personally authorized payments to the very shell companies she'd been quietly investigating. The board was furious. Calls were made. For the first time, even Dean looked at her differently, just for a moment, a flicker of doubt crossing his face before he caught himself. Lila stood in that boardroom, watching years of careful, invisible work being twisted into evidence against her, and she said only one thing, calm and steady despite everything. "Facts don't shout. People do." Then she asked them to actually look, not at what had been placed in front of them, but at what had been quietly removed from the records over the past 10 years. Dean hesitated. Then, instead of trusting the version of events being handed to him, he ordered a full internal audit, and this time, he brought in an outside forensic accounting firm with no ties to anyone at Heather Global. Over the following weeks, investigators traced the shell companies, cross-checked the falsified invoices, and confirmed the identical pattern behind every single resignation over the past decade. Lila's stolen credentials were matched to a device that had never left Elvis's office. When the findings were presented to the board, there was no room left for doubt. Elvis was confronted with the evidence directly, formally removed from the company, and reported to authorities. The stolen funds were traced and, over the following months, largely recovered. Slowly, 10 years of carefully hidden theft, buried beneath one man's grief and another man's greed, came undone. In the months that followed, the atmosphere inside Heather Global slowly began to change. Meetings still started on time, but people no longer flinched walking into them. Dean remained exactly as demanding as before, but something underneath had softened. He wasn't leading through fear anymore. He was simply leading. Nobody who worked there could quite explain the shift, only that it felt real. Eventually, Lila submitted her own resignation, not out of fear this time, but because the chapter she'd been meant to be part of was complete. Dean read the letter slowly, then looked up at her with something close to a smile. You're the first person who didn't change because of me, he said quietly. Lila shook her head. No, she replied. You're the one who changed. Not long after, Dean established a foundation in his sister's name, dedicated to helping families reconnect after loss and tragedy, turning 10 years of quiet guilt into something that could actually help someone else. The man once known around that office only for his temper became known, slowly and permanently, for something else entirely. Not fear. Respect. Sometimes the people who seem the hardest to reach aren't cruel. They're just still carrying something nobody ever asked them about. If you were in Lila's position, would you have stayed after everything that happened, or would you have walked away like the 47 before her? And if you were Dean, do you think you could have forgiven yourself the way he eventually did? Let us know in the comments below, because we genuinely read every single one. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because the next unforgettable story is already on its way.